Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. A young 26-year-old male passenger who was cured of Ebola in Liberia has tested positive on arrival in Delhi. Does this mean India has its first Ebola patient? And secondly, how prepared is India to handle this dreaded disease? That's the big question in part 2. But first, as Prime Minister Modi winds up his 10-day visit to Myanmar, Australia and Fiji, we ask, is foreign policy firmly established as his strong suit? And does his style and practice of it promote his own image rather than that of the country and its interests? Or is that a jaundiced view of his successful rallies? Amidst the acclaim of his supporters and the criticism of his opponents, we try and see where the truth actually lies. That's the first discussion tonight. Joining me now to discuss Narendra Modi's foreign policy and the way he has succeeded in projecting himself through his international rallies is former Foreign Secretary Krishnan Srinivasan, former Secretary in the MEA KC Singh, the Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times and a member of the National Security Advisory Board, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, and the Diplomatic Editor of the Hindu, Suhasini Haider. Krishnan Srinivasan, Mr. Modi has established more or less a tradition of addressing large NRI gatherings on his major trips abroad. They attract enormous attention in the host country and of course they keep people in India riveted to television. And as a result, media in India in particular has decided that these are the focal points of his visit. Now, does that serve to project India's interests or does it only really promote Mr. Modi's own image?
Well, I think as far as the media's attention to these rallies is concerned, I think that's surely a distortion, because he's done very good work in foreign policy quite apart from these rallies. These rallies are incidental to the main purpose for which he's gone abroad. And while it's excellent that he's giving the Indian community a sense of morale, that he has, I think, enlisted their support in programs in India, etc., I think that his main objectives have been well served when he's been abroad doing his work in, I think, mainly promoting economic matters for India and promoting our neighborhood policy.
But you believe it's the media that's distorting the importance of the rallies by promoting them unnecessarily and showing them at great length, rather than Mr. Modi providing something that would be irresistible temptation?
Well, I don't blame the media for this, because after all, the media can attend those rallies from start to finish. They know everything that's going on in regard to his multilateral and bilateral visits. It's very difficult for them to get any inside information on what actually was discussed. So I don't blame them at all for doing this. And elements of Modi's policies do emerge in these rallies as well. But I think undue attention shouldn't be given to this aspect. Modi has managed to turn the Indian communities abroad from really being known for rather critical and carping attitudes towards India as great supporters and partisans of India, and I think that's a very good thing.
KC Singh, one of the common features at these rallies are those rising chants reaching a crescendo of Modi, Modi, Modi. Some people say this is reminiscent of American presidential campaigns and what they call the making of the American president. Others, unfortunately, compare it to far less favorable historical comparisons. Either way, is it building up a personality cult rather than focusing on the issues Indian foreign policy wishes to pursue?
Well, to comment on that, we must place the visit in the context. It was a difficult context because East Asia Summit had 18 major powers there. G20 has again 20 major powers. So to be in those countries in the shadow of, say, Obama or Xi or Medvedev and Putin is not easy to retain attention. I mean, that is the first thing. And I think overall, Prime Minister Modi has held himself well. He's managed to project his point of view. And there may be broad brushing and amplifying of the success of whatever he has achieved, but that is natural for any Prime Minister. Therefore, but the rallies with the Indians, I think we must remember that today with television, there is really not much difference between what you do in India and what you do abroad. So he's really playing to both the stages. He's playing to the Indian audience back home, and he's playing to the expatriate audience. In a sense, he's made them seamless.
Okay.
And that is a great success for him to draw the diaspora in. And that's why the dropping, and that's why the handouts on visas, etc., and the PIO cards and OCI, there was nothing new that he gave them in Australia beyond what he had announced in US. But he's drawing them into a seamless India and Indian diaspora. And therefore, it is one common stage on which he projects himself.
So, Ashni Adar, let me put you a criticism that is made by Mr. Modi's critics of the way these rallies are used to project himself rather than project India's interests. And it's an example from something Mr. Modi said in his Sydney speech. There was a point where he seemed to be belittling the RBI, the Finance Ministry, even the PMO's efforts at opening bank accounts before he said he had set a deadline of 150 days and it had been met. And critics turned around and say this is an example of Mr. Modi promoting himself, perhaps even showing off at the cost of the Indian system.
Well, I don't think there's any question that Mr. Modi does see a certain conflation of himself and the country's image, if you like. And when he promotes that very strong image of himself as a decision maker, I presume what he's trying to communicate is that the country is now on a track where it has strong decision making going on and new things are going to emerge. Look, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how he gets the message across if the message is in fact getting across. You can't blame him for bringing personal energy to these visits. He's met at least 50 leaders in the last 6 months. He's made 7 visits, totaling of about 30 days outside this country. That takes a lot of personal energy as well. If the criticism should be there, Karan, it should be much more that there isn't a more decentralization of what he is trying to do in foreign policy, the follow-ups, the decision-making devolution, if you like, the transparency. That's what has lagged behind, if you like.
You know, let me put one other point too, and in a sense it emerges, Krishna Srinivasan, out of what Suhasini said when she talked about perhaps the inevitable conflation between Mr. Modi and India and India's policies. Now, these rallies raise enormous expectations, and those expectations are really centered around the person of the Prime Minister. Don't they therefore end up equating India's performance and India's future with the Prime Minister's potential?
Well, I think really that India has benefited hugely from this exposure that Modi has had abroad. Modi is very highly regarded, coming from almost nothing, almost unknown in foreign capitals. He's now become a rock star in Australian parlance. I think India has benefited hugely from this. Modi may be forgotten after he leaves the shores of Australia or wherever it is, but India will remain.
Isn't there a
in
danger
people's
of the
minds.
opposite? That in fact Mr. Modi, his personality, his style will be remembered. The issues that concern India will have either been subordinated or forgotten. The personality has won, but the policies that he wanted to represent have been subordinated.
Possibly, again, you're referring to the rallies rather than his interactions with
I'm referring
government.
to the headlines in the papers that you're talking about.
But I don't think that's so. I think that what will remain is the potential of India, the promise of India, and that India has been put on the map.
Okay.
And I would much rather a person is, if you like, excessively energetic and active and carries India along with that image,
than the opposite.
Rather than the opposite of a person who is retiring and low-key, and India is nowhere.
All right, K.C. Singh, let's turn this discussion on its head and go the other way. There is a reverse point of view that these rallies are in fact a new and novel way of influencing foreign governments and leaders. For instance, the Madison Square rally, where there were some 50 American congressmen and senators, sent a powerful message to White House as well as to Capitol Hill. The All Phones Arena rally in Sydney similarly sent a very powerful message to politicians in Canberra. Do you accept the view that these rallies are a sort of force multiplier for Indian foreign policy, a very new and novel tool that Mr. Modi has invented?
Well, it will depend on the country. I think in US, perhaps the size of the population, considering most of them will be US citizens, perhaps they function as a lobbying group. In Australia, that may not be so, because most of the 500,000 or 400,000 people have gone in the last 10, 15 years. So we don't know what are their roots and where exactly they are located. But in any case, we must remember that the Australian government, they are not naive. Amongst the three leaders who addressed the parliament, you had Prime Minister Cameron and then you had President Xi. President Xi's business with Australia is $150 billion. Ours is $15 billion, 1/10 of that. President Xi negotiated a free trade agreement. He's drawn Australia into a different grasp. We are a small player in that sense. We are still grappling with the nuclear cooperation agreement and so on and so forth. So nice smiles will be put by the Australians. There's great potential in the relationship. But the Australians are playing all sides. They are dealing with the Chinese. They realize that they have to butter their toast both ways.
You know, what we're talking about, Pramipal Chaudhary, is whether Mr. Modi's rallies give him an opportunity to punch way above India's weight, and therefore, in a sense, they become what I called a force multiplier, a new tool for Indian foreign policy, a new way of influencing governments, or whether these rallies are actually a platform from which Mr. Modi's personality and his style is being promoted, and India's interests, India's policies subordinated. Which of the two views do you concur with?
Well, I think it depends on what he does with this over the next 5 years. What we know in America is that we were able to, at least temporarily during the nuclear deal, for example, successfully produce a lobby group based around the Indian American community that was absolutely crucial in getting that deal done.
And we did it without staging Modi-style rallies, yet it was extremely effective in that it delivered the nuclear deal.
Yeah, I mean, the rallies is just one of the instruments that you can do. In this case, in the deal, we basically did enormous degrees of phone calls and lobbying and so on and so forth across America. But the point is that we immediately allowed, once the nuclear deal was over, that entire Indian-American lobby group that we created disintegrated because we didn't know what to do with them. They never institutionalized. And our government basically lost interest in it.
I completely accept that UPA didn't take to its logical conclusion what it began.
But we now have this similar size in terms of proportion, similar communities in Canada, Australia, to some degree maybe even in the UK, though that's such an old community, its links to India are now relatively weak. So if Modi is able, combined with our own diplomacy, to create them, forge them into a lobby group, that won't necessarily answer to India all the time, but can make the local political class say to themselves, okay, here is a group of voters who will actually occasionally vote on concerns about the relationship, our bilateral relationship.
And Modi is using that to leverage his own policies and India's interests.
Yeah, and I think, but the flip side is also that he's sending a domestic message as well. He knows this is popular back home in India.
And a personal message as well about himself.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Ashni, there is another flip side, because this argument about the rallies and their utility, or whether they're self-promotion or national promotion, has several arguments on both sides. One of the flip sides is that when Mr. Modi's desire to address public rallies runs up against the disinclination of the host country, as initially it did in Nepal, where he's going next week, he insisted and got his way. Now, when he insists and gets his way, as he's done in Nepal, because he will be addressing a public gathering there next week, does it leave a sour taste in the host country's mouth? Or is that not a problem for him?
Well, Karan, of course, it was the Hindu that reported that story out of Nepal, and certainly the size of the crowd that I think the Indian government had indicated they would like to include for the public rally is not something that the Nepal government has gone along with simply because of security concerns in places like this. So it'll be a much smaller crowd that will be listening to Prime Minister Modi's message, but of course it will be on the airwaves. You're bringing up an interesting point, because at one stage, even at Madison Square Gardens, I remember having a conversation with an American official who said, you know, what is interesting is here we are in the middle of New York, and I can't see an American flag anywhere. All I see is flags of India. I noticed that there in Australia as well, that it was really about India. You know, when you say Vande Mataram or Bharat Mata Ki Jai inside a crowd like that, it's interesting what the host country is going to make of it. In Nepal, of course, there are larger political considerations. The proximity of India and Nepal perhaps makes it a little more disconcerting for the host countries. But these are all the small microcosm. Karan, you know, when you get to the actual newspapers or the actual mainstream coverage of Prime Minister Modi's visit in these other countries, certainly in the US, Australia and other countries, I don't think he's making any major headlines in that sense. And I agree with Pramit that a lot of the message that he's making is actually for domestic audiences.
But there is one interesting thing, Krishna Srinivasan, and it emerges if you ask the question the other way around, as Salman Khurshid did. How would India respond if African heads of state were to come here, and there will be several coming for the African summit, which has been postponed, but it will happen next year, and decide they want to hold public rallies to address citizens of their country or citizens of their continent, particularly in view of the fact that Somnath Bharati was so gratuitously rude to them? Or how would India respond if the Nepali Prime Minister said, I want to hold a rally in your country to address expatriate Nepalis, and there are many more expatriate Nepalis in India than there are expatriate Indians in Australia? Would we welcome it? Would we have concerns about it? Would we be happy for Nepali flags to dominate an Indian stadium, or African flags to dominate an Indian stadiums with Vive Afrique being shouted?
Well, I think we might be a little bemused by the idea that, let's say, an African head of state or a combined collection of African heads would like to meet the communities in India.
Only bemused?
But I don't
Only
think...
bemused?
But I was going to say, but I think on no account would we try and prevent it, and we would have no objection whatsoever if that meeting was to take place. I'd like to say
what
here,
if it
though,
was a Nepali Prime Minister addressing millions of Nepalis?
Even so, I don't think there would be any objection at all.
Not an objection, but would we in our heart of hearts feel this was inappropriate and wrong? Would we rather it hadn't happened, even though to object would be an error?
No, not wrong, certainly. They just maybe occasion for a little surprise, because I don't think this has actually been done on this kind of scale before. But
he set a precedent for others to, he set a precedent for others to follow.
Who is this?
Mr. Modi.
Yes, but don't forget that our prime ministers, whenever they go to America, have been doing this all the time. I think there's hardly a prime minister who has not had these public meetings, either in New York or in Washington. And I think that the reason why it hasn't attracted that much attention is because they've been very low-key compared to Modi's
You're a member of the National Security Advisory Board. Would we be touchy and sensitive about a Nepali Prime Minister addressing 300,000 or 400,000, maybe just 20,000, 30,000 Nepalis in Jawaharlal Nehru Stadium in Delhi, with Nepali flags and the Nepali national anthem?
Holding a rally in itself doesn't really matter. The question is really, what is the message of the rally?
Precisely.
Yeah. So if
and the subliminal message more than the overt one.
So, but I can't see what would a Nepali Prime Minister say in India that would particularly bother us. Nepalese already have the right of residence in the country. An Indian Chief of Army Staff can, in theory, be a Nepalese citizen. We give them already almost the closest thing, virtually other than voting rights and a few senior positions. A Nepalese can do anything he wants in this country. We would obviously not be so happy if somebody were to come in from Pakistan and hold similar rally and call for, let's say, that Kashmir be handed over back to Pakistan. Obviously that would be a message of, that would be a rally that would effectively be hostile. But similarly, if we were to hold a rally in any of these other countries and the Indian Prime Minister was to say something that was clearly hostile or affects the national security of that other country, then obviously they would not be so welcome. It's the message that matters, and in these cases the message is quite innocuous.
We've got to make sure it stays innocuous.
Yeah.
KC Singh, let's broaden this discussion one step further. Are you surprised that foreign policy has emerged as Mr. Modi's strong suit? One gets the impression that far more than good governance and the economy, which were his real stress points in his campaign, it's foreign policy that carries not just his individual and distinct stamp, but also has attracted the most attention as far as his government's performance is concerned.
You see, much of what he is doing is really a follow-up on what has been done in the last, since about 1991. See, Look East was developed by Narasimha Rao. Neighborhood was, again, every Prime Minister in the last 2 decades has reached out to the neighborhood, including Prime Minister Vajpayee. If he is going to be taking a bus into Nepal now, Prime Minister Vajpayee took one to Lahore. I was then the spokesman. So what he's done is he's brought a new style to it, a new assertiveness. You take, for instance, the quadrilateral meeting when I was Additional Secretary in 2007. At the Additional Secretary level, we had a meeting of Australia, Japan, US and India, which really upset the Chinese. And that was done during Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's time. This time, only 3 of them met on the sidelines of G20. Prime Minister Modi didn't join them because he didn't want to upset China at that level. So in some things, he's moderated. He doesn't want to go the full Monty. But essentially, in whatever he's done, East Asia Summit is not his creation. G20 is not his creation. But his style is his own. And bringing the diaspora in, playing to the audiences back home, it does take the focus away from substance. For instance, G20, the claim is that he's brought the focus back on black money, which is not correct. Because the FATF, the set up by the G7 in 1989 is looking after money laundering for the last 2 decades.
Can I interrupt? You said something very interesting. The focus on rallies means he's taking the focus away from substance. Which is in India's foreign policy's greater interest? That the focus should be on the substance of our policy or on the person, style and personality of the Prime Minister? Because the rallies do the latter, don't they?
I think it has to be on that, but the problem is that when you're at G20, there are so many stars. You know, Xi and Obama will perforce take the focus. So then you devise a means of projecting it. So you come out with some paragraph and say, oh, Prime Minister did it. When the St. Petersburg communique last year of G20 also has money laundering, also has tax evasion. So this has been a part of the agenda of G20. So they have to look for something to say, this is what he did. But in bilateral, you can focus on both policy and audience. But multilateral or plurilateral, it becomes very difficult.
I'm not sure whether Mr. K.C. Singh is actually approving of the rallies or critical of the rallies, because he's batted both ways on this particular occasion. But I want to come back to the fact that foreign policy has emerged as Mr. Modi's surprise strong point. How much of that is to do with the fact that he enjoys being on the international stage and it brings out the best of his showmanship? Or am I putting it unfairly rather than
I think a little unfairly. Several of these meetings, I think, were thrust on him. The multilateral meetings have been planned ages in advance, and he was one of the participants, and he was more or less obliged to go. He hasn't gone to 2 or 3 other multilateral events where he could have gone, but the ones where he felt it was compulsory to go, he has gone to. And as far as his bilateral visits are concerned, leaving aside Japan, they've all been in the neighborhood, which I think is very laudable.
I'm going to put that same question to you, Suhasini Haidar. Is he such a success with foreign leaders? And the funny thing is, he's actually established a friendship or a rapport with Obama, with Abbott. You've got Prime Minister Cameron praising him today in the House of Commons, calling him a man of vision. Earlier, Obama called him a man of action. Is that because there's something about his personality or his showmanship, which is perhaps a slightly derogatory way of referring to it, that grabs and captures attention? Some people have it, some don't. Mr. Modi does, and he uses it to his best.
Absolutely. And Karan, the fact is that just the qualities that had Mr. Modi elected as this country's Prime Minister are the very qualities that he is showcasing, if you like, in all of these meetings. I don't think that there is a bilateral meeting he has gone into where going into the meeting we have not been informed or told already about some kind of personal side to it, whether it's a personal gift that has been handed over to Prime Minister Abe, or it was the fact that he was going to be fasting when he spoke to President Obama, or that personal walk between the two. The fact is, it is a part of the whole package of Prime Minister Modi that he is not just there conducting bilateral business. He is making that image. The optics are also very much a part of it, and there's a personalization to it. Prime Minister Abbott and he exchanged khadi gifts, for example. There's a personalization over there as well. The question is really, is that something that is somehow detrimental to India's foreign policy? And I would say no. I think the real problem, as I said, is that we are not focusing enough on the fact that if the Prime Minister is meeting 50 leaders, if he's doing 7 visits, which is much more than the 2, I think, average by his predecessors in 6 months, if he's spending 1 month out of 6 months abroad, not to mention the incoming visitors, where is the follow-up going to come from? Why is the Foreign Minister not an integral part of all of these visits? Who is going to do all that tying up of the loose ends? It's not possible for the Prime Minister to do that.
Is that, in a sense, and I'm going to ask you to give me a brief answer, one of the problems that Mr. Modi enjoys being the center of attention, he enjoys the limelight, and he performs brilliantly. Yeah. He is a sort of performer in that respect, and I don't mean that to be derogatory. But the Foreign Office, the Foreign Minister, are being pushed to the sidelines. And once told, if the rumours are to be believed, the Foreign Secretary as well. Is that one of the downsides of focusing the attention on the top man in this very personal way? But a quick answer, because we're horribly out of time.
Well, I think in this case, you have to keep in mind that the Foreign Office, as far as the Prime Minister is concerned, he doesn't see it as delivering. It's not delivering on the kind of diplomacy he wants. I think the real issue there is that he wants to get a new Foreign Secretary and a Foreign Ministry leadership that matches his kind of thinking on foreign policy, which, while we talk about the showmanship, actually it's very substantially driven. And that's what's missing. I think he doesn't feel he's getting those inputs from the Foreign Ministry.
In other words, he's taking on the task himself rather than relying on others to do it.
But he knows
and
he
so
can't
there's
do
a
that
logic behind the personalization,
Yes.
which his critics may not see, but he thinks justifies it.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to have to leave this particular discussion there. My thanks to both of you for coming to studio.